The rhythmic, heavy scrape of the windshield wipers pushing freezing sleet off the cracked glass of my F-250 work truck was the only sound in the cab. I was driving down the affluent, deeply shaded streets of the Oak Creek subdivision. The pristine, manicured lawns and massive brick facades blurred past my passenger window in the dull afternoon light. I gripped the thick plastic steering wheel. My hands were encased in a pair of deeply stained, stiff leather work gloves that my old landscaping mentor had given me years ago. They smelled like diesel fuel, wet earth, and old sweat. Their heavy, unyielding grip was a constant reminder that protecting your hands with a rigid physical barrier is the absolute only way you survive pulling out toxic roots. I was driving to the Community Recreation Center. I was driving there to systematically uproot my mother's entire life. The blinding, sterile glare of a smartphone screen in the pitch black of a freezing, single-wide trailer. 4 months ago. It was a Tuesday morning, the exact day I was scheduled to wire the final down payment for my wedding venue. I had spent 4 years living in that drafty, uninsulated trailer, delaying my own life, enduring grueling physical labor in the sun to save exactly $30,000 in a joint legacy cash fund. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark, shivering in my thermal shirt, and opened the banking app to initiate the transfer. The gray loading circles spun for a microsecond, and then the numbers populated on the screen. 0. Not a low balance, not a pending hold. Exactly $0.00. If you have ever had to sit in the freezing dark and stare at a glowing digital screen that proves the woman who gave you life just secretly cannibalized your entire future to fund her own neighborhood vanity, tell me how your biological systems process that betrayal without completely shutting down. How do you take your next breath when you realize your own mother views your grueling physical sacrifices as nothing more than a disposable asset? $30,000. Let me explain the exact physical friction of that money. I am a commercial groundskeeper. I don't plant delicate flower beds. I handle heavy structural landscaping, moving tons of compacted dirt, laying retaining walls, digging trenches. Every single Sunday night, I would sit on the rusted metal steps of my trailer with a cheap putty knife and a heavy tin of industrial roofing tar. I would manually spread the thick, toxic-smelling black sludge over the split seams of my heavy leather work boots. I couldn't afford a new pair of waterproof boots because every spare cent I made was going directly into that savings account. I lived in absolute, suffocating terror that the morning dew would seep through the cracked leather during a 12-hour shift. If my socks got wet at 6 a.m., I would have to work 10 more hours in freezing mud, risking agonizing foot rot before I could even clock out. The sharp chemical stench of that hot tar is permanently burned into my sinuses. I was running on fumes and tar for 4 years. The heavy rumble of my truck engine accelerating toward the HOA meeting shook the cab, pulling me back to the present. I downshifted, my heavy boot pressing the clutch. While I had been sitting on that mattress, staring at a zero balance with roofing tar permanently stained under my fingernails, my phone buzzed. A notification from my mother's social media page. She didn't answer my panicked, frantic phone calls that morning. Instead, she was live streaming. She was standing in our family's massive backyard, pointing her phone at a crew of contractors installing imported Italian marble patio stones around a massive, unpermitted luxury pool she had secretly excavated over the weekend. Her caption read, "Building a beautiful legacy for the family name. #blessed." My mother was the undisputed matriarch of the year in her wealthy suburban circle. Her entire reality was built on absolute public optics. She didn't scream or throw tantrums when challenged. She used heavy, suffocating religious and traditional guilt. If I ever questioned her spending, she would put a hand to her chest, look at me with profound, performative disappointment, and deliver this sickeningly pious lecture. "A daughter's duty is to honor her mother's sacrifices, Harper. Everything I built is for the glory of this family's name. How dare you question the blessings we've been given?" She used family loyalty like an invasive weed species, choking out the oxygen in the room so nobody could look at the toxic soil beneath her aesthetic. The pool wasn't about family. It was about pure vanity. It was solely constructed to host the neighborhood's annual summer gala, proving her absolute social dominance to a group of women who traded gossip like currency. So why didn't I just drive to the municipal clerk's office and file a civil fraud report for identity theft the second I saw the zero balance? Because the leverage she held was absolute. My mother currently held temporary legal custody of my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe was 17. She was just months away from her high school graduation. My mother weaponized her constantly. If I retaliated, if I called a lawyer, or if I threatened to expose the stolen wedding fund to the extended family, my mother made it brutally clear she would kick Chloe out onto the street, destroying her chance at a diploma. It was a complete hostage situation. I was already secretly paying for Chloe's survival out of my meager landscaping wages. I bought her biology textbooks. I bought her monthly transit passes. I bought the cheap generic groceries she snuck into her bedroom because my mother refused to spend money on anything that couldn't be photographed and shown off to the neighborhood. My mother was blowing $30,000 on imported patio marble, and I was buying discount peanut butter so my sister wouldn't starve during final exams. My father knew all of it. He was a tragic bystander, completely plagued by this profound terror of dying alone. He knew the money was stolen, but he was so desperately afraid of divorce that he blindly enabled her delusions to keep the peace. Whenever I tried to corner him in the driveway about the missing cash, he would execute this pathetic theatrical evasion. The exact microsecond I pulled out the printed bank statement, he would suddenly clutch his chest. He would gasp for air, leaning against his car, claiming a severe heart palpitation. He faked a medical emergency to force me to drop the issue and fetch him a glass of water, weaponizing his own health to avoid confronting his wife's theft. And then there was Brenda, the next-door neighbor, a viciously competitive gossip who acted as my mother's personal hype woman. Brenda would stand on the property line, clinking the ice cubes in her sweet tea, and constantly judge my dirty canvas work clothes whenever I drove my truck up to the house to drop off groceries for Chloe. My truck hit a deep pothole, the heavy suspension groaning in protest. Sitting on the passenger seat right next to me, vibrating against the cracked vinyl upholstery, is a crumpled, mud-stained piece of paper. It is a carbon copy invoice for heavy excavation equipment. I found it sticking out of my mother's outdoor recycling bin 2 nights ago when I was dropping off Chloe's textbooks in the dark. My mother thought it was just a boring receipt for the pool contractors. She threw it away. Make no mistake, she didn't realize that a groundskeeper doesn't just look at the beautiful flowers. We look at the structural erosion beneath them. I am reaching out and touching the rough edge of that invoice right now, and I promise you, this crumpled piece of trash is the exact geometric anomaly that is going to trigger a complete foundational collapse of her entire life. The crunch of my heavy work boots on the pristine, imported gravel of my mother's driveway was the only sound I could hear over the ringing in my ears. I was holding a single tri-folded piece of paper from the local bank branch, a printed teller receipt. I had driven straight from the bank to her house, my hand shaking so violently against the steering wheel I had nearly swerved off the road twice. I walked into the massive backyard. My mother was standing on the edge of a massive, gaping excavation trench, pointing a manicured finger at a crew of laborers operating a small backhoe. She was wearing a pristine white linen sundress and an oversized straw sun hat, completely unbothered by the chaos of the construction zone. She turned around and saw me standing there. She didn't look guilty. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, reaching into a small cardboard box of landscaping decor resting on a patio table. She pulled out a cheap, generic garden rug, the kind you buy for $4 at a discount hardware store. Painted on the fake resin surface in cursive looping lettering was the phrase, "Family First." She walked over and pressed the cheap rock against my dirty canvas work jacket. "I bought this for the front steps of your little trailer, Harper." She smiled, her voice dripping with this pious, untouchable grace. "To remind you of your roots. You really need to start valuing the blessings we've been given." If you have ever had to stare at a cheap piece of painted resin, proving you were just a family scapegoat for a narcissistic mother's vanity, tell me how you biologically survived that first hour without completely dropping to the dirt. How do you process a $4 rock when the person handing it to you just stole $30,000 of your physical labor? "You forged my signature on a withdrawal slip," I started, the heavy paper shaking in my grip, my voice cracking under the sheer weight of the betrayal. "I reallocated our resources, Harper," she interrupted smoothly, adjusting her sun hat as if we were discussing the weather. "The money was just sitting there doing absolutely nothing." "You stole $30,000! You are acting completely ungrateful right now." My mother sighed, crossing her arms, weaponizing her traditional guilt with terrifying speed. "I raised you. Your money is family money, and this house is our legacy. You should be honored to contribute to the roof over your sister's head, instead of being so selfish about a silly little party. A daughter's duty is to honor her mother's sacrifices." "I am calling the civil fraud investigators," I whispered, pulling my phone from my pocket. My mother's pious maternal smile vanished in a microsecond. The mask dropped, replaced by absolute cold steel. "If you bring low-class energy into my neighborhood," my mother stated, her voice dropping into a flat, terrifyingly calm register. "If you try to humiliate this family over a financial misunderstanding, Chloe's bags will be on the curb tonight. I am her temporary legal guardian. I will formally evict her. She can figure out how to graduate high school while sleeping in a state-run youth shelter. Is that what you want for your sister?" The leverage was a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty. She had tethered my $30,000 to an innocent 17-year-old girl's physical safety. It was an absolute hostage situation. The glass sliding door to the patio rattled open. My father stepped out onto the wooden deck, the exhausted enabler. He saw the printed bank statement in my shaking hand and immediately froze. "Dad," I pleaded, my voice breaking, desperate for any structural support. "Dad, she walked into the branch and drained the joint account. She took my entire wedding fund. You have to make her put it back." My father looked at the paper. He looked at the massive excavation trench. And then, his terror of abandonment completely overrode his basic humanity. He couldn't face the reality of confronting his wife. He aggressively clutched the center of his chest with his right hand. He staggered back against the glass door, his mouth opening in a wide, dramatic gasp. "My chest," my father wheezed, squeezing his eyes shut, executing a pathetic, theatrical evasion right in front of me. "The palpitations. Harper, please. My heart cannot take this kind of stress right now. You are causing a severe medical episode. I need water. I need to lie down." He literally faked a cardiac event right to my face. He turned his back on me, stumbled inside, and slid the glass door shut, leaving me completely alone in the dirt. "Honestly, Harper, your mother is just trying to improve the community value." I turned my head. Brenda, the viciously competitive flying monkey from next door, was leaning over the Cedar property fence. She was swirling a glass of iced tea, looking at my mud-stained boots with pure, unfiltered disgust. "Stop screaming in those dirty clothes," Brenda loudly lectured, ensuring the construction crew could hear her. "Your mother is bringing so much joy to this neighborhood with this beautiful project, and you just sound completely unhinged. You should be thanking her for elevating the property values." I couldn't scream. If I fought back, Chloe's diploma and her physical safety would be vaporized by midnight. I was completely paralyzed by the hostaging of my sister. I turned around, walked back to my rusted truck, and drove away in total silence. The physical toll of the betrayal didn't hit me in the driveway. It hit me 14 hours later. It was 5 o'clock the next morning. It was pitch black outside, the temperature hovering just below freezing. I was sitting in the cab of my F-250, parked on the gravel shoulder outside a massive commercial landscaping site. I had a 12-hour shift of manual labor ahead of me, moving heavy pallets of retaining wall blocks, digging irrigation trenches in the frozen mud. I looked down at my heavy leather work boots. The industrial roofing tar I had smeared over the cracked seams on Sunday night was completely frozen. My feet were already numb. I pulled my phone out of my canvas pocket. I opened the banking app. 0. I just stared blankly at the steering wheel. The ambient noise of the truck cab vanished, and my chest seized up like heavily compacted clay, the air completely failing to drain into my lungs. My entire body started to violently tremble. My hands shook so badly I dropped the phone onto the floorboards. This was the true horror of the clock-in mask. I didn't have the luxury of a cinematic breakdown. I didn't have time to weep or process the grief, because if I didn't clock in exactly 3 minutes, I would lose my landscaping job, and my sister would starve. The crushing weight of systemic survival completely overrode my ability to simply cry. I sat there in the freezing dark, gasping for air, the smell of diesel fuel and old coffee suffocating me. And then, a brief, hyper-specific memory flashed in the darkness. I remembered my old landscaping mentor standing in the pouring rain years ago, his heavy boots sunk deep into the mud. I remembered the exact moment he handed me these deeply stained, thick leather work gloves. His voice was steady and calm over the roar of the heavy machinery. He told me that protecting your hands with a rigid barrier is the absolute only way you survive pulling out toxic roots. The grief of mourning a mother who was still physically standing in her backyard was profound. It was a suffocating, biological exhaustion. But the memory of my mentor's gloves was a heavy, physical anchor. I reached onto the dashboard and picked up the stiff leather gloves. I slid them onto my hands, the rough interior leather scraping against my calloused skin. The physical friction of the gloves instantly stopped my hands from shaking. The tears completely dried up. The cold, hard knot of trauma in my stomach solidified into something entirely different. Mechanical, structural logic. I realized in that freezing truck cab that my family was nothing more than an invasive weed species. You do not negotiate with an invasive root system. You don't ask it to stop choking the life out of the foundational soil. You treat it as a complete structural erosion. You simply locate the primary taproot in the dirt, grip it with absolute mechanical force, and systematically rip it out of the property line forever. It is the cruelest form of biological mathematics. You convince yourself that if you just haul 1 more ton of dirt, if you just patch your boots 1 more time, if you just bleed enough physical capital into the ground, you can eventually balance the ledger of their dysfunction. But you cannot outwork a structural sinkhole that requires your total bankruptcy to sustain its aesthetic. They don't want you to heal. They need you exhausted, constantly acting as the cheap topsoil to absorb the toxic runoff of their fake reality. The immense physical energy it takes to maintain their perfect neighborhood illusion doesn't just exhaust your muscles, it fundamentally hollows out your skeleton. I spent 4 years acting as a human retaining wall for a mother who weaponized her own vanity and a father who outsourced his spine to avoid a difficult conversation. And the most devastating part? They will sleep perfectly soundly tonight under a roof I maintained, sipping wine on imported marble, while I sit here choking on the smell of diesel fuel and freezing tar, calculating exactly how to keep a 17-year-old girl from starving. The heavy rusted hinges of the massive municipal recycling bin squealed loudly in the pitch black of the driveway. It was 2:14 a.m. The freezing rain had turned the imported gravel of my mother's estate into a slick, icy hazard. I had parked my heavy work truck 2 blocks away, creeping through the affluent, silent neighborhood on foot. The physical friction of what I was doing was agonizing. My heavy canvas jacket was soaked through. My stiff leather work gloves were coated in freezing wet cardboard and rotting grass clippings. I was literally digging through my mother's garbage in the dead of night. I plunged my hands deeper into the damp, smelling refuse, moving aside empty bottles of expensive imported wine and glossy country club magazines. And then, a bright, blinding white light suddenly flooded the driveway. The motion sensor security floodlight on Brenda's garage next door had tripped. I completely froze, my hands buried in the freezing trash. And almost immediately, the physiological panic hit me. My throat closed up so tightly I couldn't pull oxygen into my lungs. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across my collarbones, completely overriding the freezing temperature of the rain. My knees buckled slightly, and my hands started to violently shake against the plastic rim of the bin. It was that deeply conditioned, pathetic scapegoat reflex. My mother's pious, suffocating voice suddenly echoed in my ears, loud and absolute. "A daughter's duty is to honor her mother's sacrifices, Harper. You are bringing low-class energy into this neighborhood. How dare you question the blessings we've been given?" What if she was right? What if I was just a toxic, ungrateful daughter aggressively trying to ruin a beautiful family legacy? The terrifying reality of questioning the matriarch triggered a profound, paralyzing fear. I was standing in the mud like a criminal. If I just walked away right now, if I just accepted the loss of the $30,000 and let her have her beautiful patio, maybe the friction would stop. My heavy leather glove literally hovered over the plastic lid, ready to slam it shut and walk away forever to keep the peace. But then, a sharp, freezing sting shot up from the heel of my left foot. The industrial roofing tar I had smeared on my heavy work boots had cracked in the freezing rain. The icy mud was slowly seeping directly into my wool sock. I looked down at my ruined boots. I thought about the 4 years of living in a drafty trailer, the absolute physical agony of patching my own clothes to save that money, and the fact that my mother was forcing my teenage sister to eat discount peanut butter while she bought Italian marble. The fear completely evaporated. It didn't turn into a fiery cinematic rage, it just turned into cold, mechanical logic. I didn't close the lid. I reached back into the damp paper and pulled out a crumpled, mud-stained yellow carbon copy. I stepped back into the shadows of the massive cedar fence, holding the paper up to the faint amber glow of the street lamp. It was a commercial invoice for heavy excavation equipment, standard backhoes and grading tractors, but the invoice itself wasn't the proof I needed. It was just a piece of paper. I looked past the cedar fence, staring out into the massive, gaping excavation trench my mother had dug in the center of the backyard. The moonlight reflected off the heavy, compacted clay and the freshly poured concrete footings. I am a commercial groundskeeper. I spend 12 hours a day analyzing foundational stability, root rot, and structural erosion. When you dig a massive hole in the earth, the surrounding topsoil displaces in a very specific geometric pattern. I didn't look at the beautiful marble pallets sitting on the grass. I looked at the raw, jagged edge of the trench near the eastern property line. I knew the exact municipal layout of this subdivision. I had laid commercial irrigation pipes in this exact neighborhood 3 years ago. I traced the spatial geometry of the trench with my eyes, calculating the depth and the width of the displaced clay. It was geometrically impossible to build a luxury pool of that exact volume in that specific location without crossing directly over the city's main protected municipal water easement. The anomaly violently crashed into my reality. My mother had bypassed the city zoning board entirely. She hadn't pulled a single municipal drainage permit because no city inspector would ever legally authorize an excavation directly over a protected, high-pressure municipal water main. The entire luxury pool was a massive, unpermitted geometric violation. I didn't need to argue with her traditional guilt. A civil violation of a protected municipal easement carries a catastrophic, legally binding stop work order and massive civil destruction fines. I shoved the yellow invoice into my canvas pocket. I didn't stop there. I grabbed the entire heavy black plastic trash bag out of the bin, threw it over my shoulder, and walked away into the freezing dark. By 8 a.m. the next morning, I was standing inside the sterile, overly air-conditioned lobby of the local bank branch downtown. I didn't scream or demand to see the manager. I used my stiff leather work gloves to slide my cracked driver's license across the polished granite counter to the teller. I explicitly reported a fraudulent, unauthorized withdrawal on my joint legacy account. Because my name was legally on the ledger, the bank manager was forced to pull the physical archive. The wait was agonizingly slow. I paced the carpeted lobby, listening to the rhythmic hum of the coin-counting machine, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room. Every second felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, the manager emerged and slid a crisp, heavy piece of watermarked paper across the desk. It was a photocopied bank withdrawal slip. I stared at the stark, blinding white paper. The sharp blue ink of the teller's validation stamp was printed across the top margin. I read the verbatim text aloud to the empty manager's office. Authorized in-branch withdrawal, $30,000. Account status, closed. Signatory, Harper Vance. It wasn't an online wire transfer. It wasn't a digital glitch. The physical security cameras verified it. My mother had physically walked into this exact branch, looked a teller dead in the eye, and flawlessly forged my signature on a physical document to drain my entire future into her personal checking account. The core financial fraud was officially documented. I walked back out to my heavy work truck parked in the blinding morning sun. I climbed into the cab, the heavy suspension groaning. The black trash bag I had stolen from her driveway was sitting on the passenger seat, smelling heavily of damp coffee grounds and rotting fruit. I put my stiff leather gloves back on and began methodically sorting the refuse across the cracked vinyl dashboard. I needed collateral damage. I needed to map the exact systemic rot of her financial decisions. Buried at the bottom of the bag, stuck to the side of a crushed cereal box, were two separate pieces of discarded mail. I carefully peeled the first one open. It was a thick, glossy paper stock with jagged, perforated edges. It smelled faintly of my mother's expensive perfume. It was a letter from a premium supplemental health insurance provider. I smoothed the crumpled paper against my steering wheel, reading the bold red text printed across the center of the page. Notice of policy termination. Supplemental cardiac coverage canceled due to non-payment. Grace period expired. My lungs completely stopped. I stared at the red ink. My father, the exhausted enabler who faked a severe heart palpitation in the driveway just to avoid confronting her, actually had a history of cardiac issues. My mother had secretly, intentionally canceled his premium supplemental heart insurance to free up the monthly cash flow for her imported Italian patio marble. She had literally sacrificed his physical medical safety for a decorative aesthetic. I dropped the glossy paper and picked up the second document. It was a digitally forwarded email printout from the local community college administrative office, crumpled into a tight ball. I flattened it out against the dashboard. Student unenrolled. Chloe Vance. Fall semester advanced college prep program. Tuition refund of $1,200. Processed to primary cardholder. I just stared at the black toner. Chloe was 17. She had worked relentlessly for 2 years to get accepted into that advanced placement prep program. It was her only ticket out of my mother's suffocating, toxic house. My mother had secretly canceled Chloe's enrollment, stolen the refunded tuition money, and used it to pay the deposit on the excavation equipment. She had actively, methodically butchered a 17-year-old girl's academic future just to upstage a rival neighbor at a summer gala. The conditioned self-doubt completely evaporated from my body. The frantic, biological panic I had felt in the driveway last night was entirely gone. I didn't feel a cinematic rush of furious rage. I didn't want to punch the dashboard or scream at the sky. I just sat in the cab of my truck, breathing the scent of damp trash and old leather, feeling the terrifying, absolute calm of a commercial groundskeeper who has finally mapped the complete perimeter of a structural sinkhole. My mother believed her pious, traditional guilt made her an untouchable matriarch. She believed she could manipulate the neighborhood optics to mask her cruelty. But she fundamentally misunderstood the environment she was building on. The City Code Enforcement Office does not care about your aesthetic, your legacy, or your reputation. They only care about the structural coordinates. I reached out and gathered the 3 pieces of evidence, sliding them into a heavy canvas folder. The tears were completely dry. The physical trembling had stopped. The foundation of her entire social empire was mathematically impossible, and the property was already legally condemned. You cannot bring heavy demolition equipment onto a site without bracing the surrounding structures first. If you swing a sledgehammer into a load-bearing wall without securing the perimeter, the roof doesn't just fall on the rot. It crushes everything trapped inside the house. My mother held the absolute legal and physical leverage over my 17-year-old sister. If I walked into that upcoming HOA meeting and dropped the municipal stop work order on the table, my mother wouldn't hesitate. She would instantly detonate Chloe's life, kicking her out onto the street before midnight just to punish me. I had to permanently cut that hostage leash in the dark. I skipped my afternoon landscaping shift, trading the hourly wages I desperately needed to drive to the county family court annex. The building was a massive brutalist concrete structure that smelled heavily of wet wool and cheap, lemon-scented floor cleaner. I pulled a damp paper ticket from the kiosk and waited in a hard plastic chair for 2 agonizing hours. Every single time the digital display buzzed, my chest tightened. I was operating on fumes and tar. My hands ached, the cracked leather of my boots leaving faint traces of mud on the pristine municipal floor. When my number finally flashed, I walked up to the thick, smudged security glass. I slid the heavy canvas folder under the metal slot. I presented the forged bank withdrawal slip, the canceled health insurance notice, and the terminated college prep enrollment to the duty clerk. I filed a preemptive emergency guardianship petition, citing documented financial fraud and educational sabotage by the acting temporary guardian. The clerk didn't ask about my feelings. She just looked at the irrefutable trail of stolen funds, stamped the thick stack of papers with a heavy wooden block, and issued a temporary protective severance order. The legal wall was built, but a piece of paper doesn't put a roof over a teenager's head. I left the courthouse and drove straight to a decaying, cheap apartment complex on the far edge of the industrial district. It was the only place that didn't require a massive security deposit. The leasing office smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. I sat across from a bored property manager. I pulled out my worn debit card, the absolute last of my remaining bi-weekly paycheck, and paid the first month's rent on a tiny ground-floor studio. The manager slid a cold, heavy brass key across the laminate desk. I picked it up. The metal dug sharply into the calloused skin of my palm. It wasn't a luxury condo, and it didn't have imported Italian marble, but it was a complete structural fortress. My mother couldn't touch it. The real terror came at 2 a.m. that night. I parked my rusted F-250 a quarter-mile down the street from my mother's affluent subdivision. I kept the headlights off. The engine ticked loudly as it cooled in the freezing, thick fog. The streetlights cast long, amber shadows across the wet asphalt. I gripped the plastic steering wheel, my teeth rattling from the cold. I was waiting for Chloe. We had communicated through a single encrypted text message. If my mother woke up and heard the floorboards creaking, if she looked out the window and saw Chloe sneaking down the driveway, the entire hostage threat would trigger before I could even start the engine. The silence was agonizing. A stray dog barked somewhere 3 blocks away, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot in the damp air. My lungs felt incredibly tight. I kept staring at the digital clock on the dashboard. 2:14 a.m., 2:17 a.m., and then a small, dark figure emerged from the freezing fog. Chloe was walking on the wet grass beside the road to avoid crunching the gravel. She was carrying a massive, heavy black trash bag over her shoulder. She looked terrified, her shoulders hunched against the biting cold, wearing a thin jacket that wasn't meant for winter weather. I pushed the heavy passenger door open. The rusted hinges let out a low groan. Chloe scrambled into the cab, dragging the heavy bag onto her lap. She slammed the door shut, instantly shivering, her breath pluming in the dark interior. She didn't look at me. She just stared at the dashboard. "She was awake," Chloe whispered, her voice a fragile, broken rasp. "I had to hide in the hallway closet for 20 minutes. She was walking around the kitchen talking to herself about the caterers for the patio party." I didn't offer a warm, maternal hug. I didn't use therapy speak. The structural reality of what we were doing required absolute pragmatic focus. I reached into the pocket of my canvas jacket and pulled out the cold brass key. I placed it directly into Chloe's trembling hand. "That is the key to an apartment on 9th Street, I said, keeping my voice incredibly low, steadying the terrified rhythm of her breathing. "The rent is paid. There is food in the fridge. Attached to it is a stamped copy of an emergency guardianship petition. She has absolutely zero legal authority over you anymore." Chloe stared down at the jagged brass metal resting in her palm. The sheer weight of the realization hit her. The suffocating, traditional guilt my mother had used to chain her to that house was completely severed. "When her HOA meeting starts on Thursday night," I continued, my voice cold and mechanical, "you are going to take this bag, walk out the back door, and call the cab company. The fare is already prepaid. You go straight to the apartment and you lock the deadbolt. You do not answer your phone. You do not look back." Chloe finally looked up at me. A single tear cut a track down her freezing cheek, but she nodded, her grip tightening around the metal key until her knuckles turned white. The leverage was completely gone. The foundational anchor my mother thought she held over my head was quietly resting in the palm of a 17-year-old girl in the dark. I put the truck in gear, the heavy transmission clunking into place. We drove away into the freezing fog, the thick mud tires rolling silently over the wet asphalt, leaving the rotting structure of my mother's aesthetic empires standing completely hollow in the night. The smell of ammonia and stale powdered donuts hung heavily in the cramped municipal zoning office. It was Thursday morning. I was standing in front of a battered metal desk, staring down at a massive laminated topographical map of the Oak Creek subdivision. I didn't have to explain the emotional abuse. I just slid the crumpled, mud-stained yellow excavation invoice across the scuffed metal surface. Sitting behind the desk was Marcus. He was a grizzled, deeply cynical city code inspector I had worked alongside for 5 years on commercial retaining wall projects. He didn't care about neighborhood gossip. He cared about structural integrity. Marcus picked up the yellow paper. He glanced at the equipment tonnage listed on the receipt, then looked down at the blue municipal water lines running directly through my mother's property grid on the map. He didn't gasp. He just pulled a red grease pencil from his shirt pocket and drew a thick, aggressive circle right over my mother's backyard. She excavated an 80,000-gallon basin directly over a high-pressure, protected municipal water easement. Marcus muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. If that retaining wall shifts by 2 inches, she floods the entire grid and collapses the street. It's a catastrophic code violation. The fine starts at 50 grand. She's accepting a neighborhood beautification award for it tonight at the community center, I said quietly, the heavy leather of my work gloves creaking as I clenched my fists. My father is completely enabling it. He fakes heart attacks to avoid stopping her. Marcus leaned back in his squeaking chair. He didn't offer me a warm, paternal hug. He didn't tell me to forgive my family or attend therapy. He just looked at my calloused, tar-stained hands with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly how structures fail. You've been paying their emotional mortgage with your own physical labor for years, Harper, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp over the humming air conditioner. Stop trying to reinforce a rotten foundation. Real family isn't the people who can mathematically afford to keep you around while you're useful. It's the people who never once pulled out a calculator to figure out what your loyalty was worth. The absolute certainty of his logic settled deep into my bones. The frantic biological panic I had carried for a week completely vanished. I nodded, turned around, and walked out into the freezing rain. 7 hours later, I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Oak Creek Community Recreation Room. The visual contrast of the room was completely absurd. The wealthy, elite residents of the subdivision, women dripping in expensive diamonds and men wearing bespoke, tailored suits, were forced to sit on cheap, rusted metal folding chairs. The stale air smelled like a chaotic mixture of high-end floral perfumes, floor wax, and the damp, decaying drywall of the community center. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting an unflattering, sickly pallor over the entire crowd. I walked into the back of the room. My heavy work boots, thick with industrial roofing tar, squeaked loudly against the scuffed linoleum. I was wearing my heavy canvas work jacket. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets, my stiff leather gloves resting heavily against my thighs. My father was already sitting in the third row. He looked incredibly nervous, his eyes darting frantically around the room, repeatedly rubbing the center of his chest, as if preparing his theatrical medical excuse, just in case anyone asked him a difficult question. And then she saw me. My mother separated from a cluster of fawning neighbors. She was wearing a pristine, flowing silk blouse and expensive tailored slacks. Her hair was perfectly blown out. She looked like the absolute apex of suburban royalty. She marched directly toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask about her missing 17-year-old daughter. She just aggressively shoved a massive, incredibly heavy designer wool coat and a thick leather purse directly into my chest. The sheer weight of the garments nearly knocked me off balance. I had to pull my hands from my pockets to catch them. "Stand in the corner by the fire extinguisher, Harper," my mother whispered, her voice a terrifyingly calm, venomous hiss. "The photographer from the local paper is here to document my award. Your boots are tracking dried mud everywhere. You look like a discarded vagrant. Hold my things and stay entirely out of the frame." She literally treated her own daughter like a hired coat check girl. She used my physical body as a piece of furniture to hold her expensive fabrics, ensuring my dirty canvas jacket wouldn't taint the background of her glorious aesthetic triumph. If you have ever been forced to stand in the corner of a public room, physically burdened by the weight of your abuser's luxury items while they accept an award funded by your stolen labor, you know the exact suffocating friction of that humiliation. The muscles in my jaw locked so tightly my teeth ached. Honestly, it's embarrassing. Brenda, the viciously competitive neighbor, suddenly appeared beside my mother. She was holding a plastic cup of cheap wine, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You couldn't even wash your face for your mother's big night." Brenda sighed loudly, swirling her wine. "She sacrifices everything to elevate this community, and you show up looking like a manual laborer. It just completely drags the energy of the room down." My mother smiled, a sickeningly pious expression of long-suffering maternal patience crossing her face. She patted Brenda's arm, adjusting her own silk collar. "It's fine, Brenda," my mother sighed dramatically. "We all have our crosses to bear. Let's find our seats." They turned their backs on me and walked toward the front row. I stood perfectly still in the shadow of the fire extinguisher, the heavy wool coat suffocating my arms. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the designer purse onto the scuffed floor. I just let the cold, mechanical logic of the foundation anchor me to the linoleum. My phone violently buzzed in my canvas pocket. I shifted the heavy coats to one arm and pulled the device out. A new message notification flashed on the locked screen. It wasn't a text from Chloe. It was a message sent directly to the main family group chat. I opened the thread. It was from my mother. "Just keep Harper holding the coats in the back of the room so her dirty boots don't ruin the aesthetic when they announce my award." My lungs completely froze. She meant to send it to Brenda in their private gossip thread, explicitly coordinating my public humiliation. She was so intoxicated by her own vanity, so completely obsessed with her upcoming moment of glory, that she tapped the wrong contact. A microsecond later, the gray text bubble vanished from the screen. She realized her mistake and deleted it, but my thumb had already pressed the physical side buttons of the phone. The blinding white flash of the screenshot capture briefly illuminated the dark corner of the rec room. The time-stamped ghost of her absolute malice was permanently saved to my camera roll. Her pious maternal mask was officially documented as a complete fraud. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. At the front of the room, a loud, piercing squeal of microphone feedback cut through the polite chatter. The HOA president, a balding man in a cheap suit, tapped the microphone stand. The wealthy neighbors took their seats, the rusted metal folding chairs groaning under their weight. The meeting was officially called to order. The trap was locked. I just crossed my arms beneath the heavy wool coats, stared at the back of my mother's perfectly styled head, and waited for the floorboards to completely collapse. The polite, scattered clapping of 60 wealthy neighbors echoed off the damp drywall of the rec room. Up at the front, standing behind a cheap folding table, the HOA president was holding a tacky, transparent plastic obelisk, the Neighborhood Beautification Award. My mother floated out of the front row, her pristine silk blouse catching the harsh fluorescent light. She accepted the cheap plastic trophy with both hands, clutching it to her chest, beaming with absolute, unshakable triumph. She looked out over the rusted folding chairs, soaking in the absolute social dominance she had stolen $30,000 to achieve. She stepped up to the microphone. I didn't say a single word. I didn't yell from the back of the room. I just shifted the heavy designer coats higher onto my left shoulder, reached out with my right hand, and pushed the heavy metal crash bar of the rear exit door. The heavy steel door swung open with a violent metallic groan. A blast of freezing, damp air swept into the stale rec room. The polite clapping instantly died. Marcus stepped through the doorframe. He wasn't wearing a bespoke suit or a pristine silk blouse. He was wearing a heavy, high-visibility municipal utility jacket, a Silver County inspector's badge clipped directly to his heavy canvas collar. His mud-caked boots hit the scuffed linoleum with a heavy, authoritative thud. He didn't wait to be introduced. He bypassed the aisles of terrified, wealthy neighbors and marched directly to the front of the room. My mother froze. Her performative, pious smile completely collapsed, her manicured fingers tightening around the cheap plastic obelisk. Marcus didn't ask for permission. He reached out anywhere, grabbed the microphone stand, and pulled it away from her. "This property association is formally served." Marcus's voice boomed through the cheap speakers, a rough, gravelly rasp that completely shattered the elite aesthetic of the room. "The residential property at 412 Oak Creek Lane is under an immediate, legally binding municipal stop work order. The homeowner has illegally excavated an 80,000-gallon basin directly over the city's protected, high-pressure water easement without pulling a single drainage permit. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the rows of folding chairs. The site is a catastrophic structural hazard to the entire subdivision, Marcus continued coldly, pulling a thick stack of red-stamped documents from his jacket. The city is issuing a $50,000 civil destruction mandate. The trench will be filled and the property condemned by tomorrow morning if the fines are not cleared. The blood completely drained from my mother's face. Her skin turned a sickening, chalky gray. She looked out at the faces of the wealthy country club women she had so desperately tried to impress. They weren't fawning over her anymore. They were staring at her with pure, unfiltered horror, realizing she had just brought a massive municipal investigation and a structural sinkhole directly into their pristine neighborhood. When an absolute narcissist is publicly cornered, they do not apologize. They do not accept the foundational collapse. They completely rewrite the reality of the room to cast themselves as a bleeding martyr. The plastic award slipped from her trembling hands and clattered against the scuffed linoleum. Her knees immediately buckled, completely failing to support her weight, and she sank backward into a rusted metal folding chair. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow gasps, her nervous system entirely unable to process the public ruin. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly across the room. Right at me.
"She is trying to destroy me,"
my mother sobbed loudly, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the rec room, tears ruining her expensive makeup.
"My own daughter! This is elder abuse. I only wanted a beautiful home for my girls, and she is trying to publicly humiliate her own mother,"
she wailed, clutching her chest, executing the exact same performative medical evasion my father used in the driveway. She waited for the wealthy neighbors to rush to her side, to validate her traditional guilt, to shame the dirty groundskeeper standing by the fire extinguisher. Nobody moved. The silence stretched out, agonizing, suffocating. It was a painfully awkward, heavy friction that completely swallowed her shrieks. I walked down the center aisle. My tar-covered boots squeaked loudly against the floor. I stopped right in front of the folding table. I didn't defend myself against the accusations of elder abuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply let the massive pile of heavy designer coats and leather bags slide off my shoulder. They hit the dirty floor with a heavy thud, completely ruining the expensive fabric in the dust. I reached into my canvas pocket. I pulled out the crisp, watermarked bank withdrawal slip. I slid the paper across the cheap folding table, directly over the shattered pieces of the plastic award, until it rested exactly in front of the HOA president. I didn't wait for his reaction, and I didn't look back at the woman hyperventilating in the folding chair. I turned around and walked out the heavy steel doors into the freezing rain. Let them drown in the collapse of their own unpermitted foundation. The structural gap is permanent, and the property line is finally cleared,